Welcome everybody, that includes you, gamers, nerds, introverts, extroverts, and everybody in between, to a video where we'll be discussing something long debated to be outdated, yet continues to exist today. What could it be, you might be wondering? The Electoral College. Woohoo! Yeah, it sounds super lame, doesn't it? But frankly, it's one of the most important things in the American democracy, because it single-handedly causes one of the world's most influential people to be elected every 4 years. And in a 2016 election alone, it saw President Trump win, despite having less votes than Hillary Clinton by the general public. Yeah, that really did happen. But before we examine its flaws and potential alternatives to the Electoral College and the viability of those alternatives, let's take a trip down memory lane and take a blast to the past. It is a hot, sweat-filled summer day in 1787 Pennsylvania, or better known as the state of Quakers, Ben Franklin, and today, Hershey. But currently, there are founding fathers cooped up in a room, boarded up, drafting what would later become the Constitution of the United States. But there were many challenges they faced, one of these challenges being how to balance the power of big states and small states, and to make sure that everyone was satisfied and happy. Looks like a lot of diplomacy had to happen. And consequently, there were a lot of compromises. Some pretty trashy, looking at you, 3/5 compromise. And some were made in good faith, but worked better in theory than in practice. One of these compromises was the Electoral College, which was intended to provide a proportional say for each state in the presidential election. As in the Electoral College, each state had as many electors as they had representatives in Congress. For example, if you had 2 senators and only 2 representatives in the House of Representatives, you had 4 votes total in the Electoral College. But therefore, because bigger states have more representatives in the House of Representatives, they'll have more electors and a higher say in the presidential election. Looking at you, California, New York, Texas, etc. It's also interesting to note the explanation that Alexander Hamilton provided in the Federalist Papers on why the Electoral College was necessary beyond just as a compromise between the bigger states and small states. To be quite frank, many of the Founding Fathers didn't necessarily have the highest opinion on the American public. They were afraid that the American public would be susceptible to outside influence or could elect someone who the Founding Fathers believed unfit for the presidency and the executive branch. Therefore, the Founding Fathers meant the Electoral College should be a failsafe filled with elitists and people involved in the government and well-educated who could maybe keep the American public in check in case of an emergency. But, as we all know, the electors didn't tend to go against the American public's wishes and tended to vote alongside the states. One of the many problems with the Electoral College is the rule known as winner takes all. It sounds epic to the winner, but it sounds quite devastating at everyone who isn't the winner. What does it mean? It means that as long as one candidate receives slightly more votes than a different candidate in a state, they get all the electoral votes in the state. They take everything. So the margins could be 55-45, 51-49, or 80-20, and regardless, the winner gets everything, while the loser, however close he may be, gets absolutely no compensation. And in fact, you don't even need the majority of the votes. You don't need more than 50% of the votes to even get all the electors in a state. If there are other candidates running, or if people just write in a candidate, you could potentially get only like 47% of the vote, 46% of the vote, and still get every single electoral vote in that state, despite the majority of the state not voting for you. For instance, one notable example of this is Bill Clinton in one of his presidential runs. He managed to win the entire presidency without winning more than 50% of the vote in basically no other state besides his home state of Arkansas. Think about that. He got most of his electoral votes and became president of a country when not even 50% of a state voted for him. That's ludicrous. The rise of hyper-partisan politics has resulted in a lot of issues. A lot of people being dissatisfied and angry with the status quo. People resort to third-party candidates as a result, like Jill Stein and Gary Johnson. Unfortunately, the problem with third-party candidates is that they tend to siphon votes disproportionately from one party more than the other. For example, if one party, say the Democratic Party, existed, they're against climate change. But if we had another political party, a third party group, that was whole slogan was to end climate change, and every policy were extreme climate preservation policies, someone who may like climate change may vote for that new third party candidate, and then consequently split the votes off in the Democratic Party, if that makes sense. Going on that same stream, the other party, the Republicans, may end up winning the state because the Democrats and that new third party group split the votes with each other. So then that state is left with a candidate who the majority of people hate and do not like still gets all the electoral votes. For example, you could still, if you had the ratios of, say, 45% for the Republican, 40% for the Democrat, and then 15% for the third party. But those 15%, 10% would have voted for the Democrat as their second choice, then the Republican. That leaves a lot of people angry because third-party candidates then are referred to as spoilers and ruin the election for the general state. At least that's how it works with winner-takes-all. Another problem with the Electoral College and winner-take-all in general is the fact that the system ensures that candidates spend more money and campaign more heavily in states that are considered purple, as in states that tend to swing back and forth between Democratic and Republican control. For example, a big purple state today that is known is Florida. Another one that you often see in the news is Ohio. Both of those states tend to go back and forth, so candidates tend to focus a lot more energy into winning over that state's electoral votes, because even if they win by razor-thin margins, those razor-thin margins could get them all the electoral votes and then get them a seat in the White House. Unfortunately, that means states like California and New York, which tend to be a lot more Democratic, don't really get much attention by Republicans or Democrats in terms of campaigning during the general presidential election season, because it's not worth the time or money investment. Because even though you have a ton of Republicans in both states, those Republicans vastly are outnumbered by the Democrats. So it's not really worth anything. It's not optimized enough for them to go there. And because of that, you have thousands upon millions of people whose votes simply don't matter because of winner takes all. Because if a state is even 70% Republican and 30% Democratic, they're not going to get any Democratic candidates campaigning there. Yet, all 30% of those Democratic votes basically mean nothing in the general election. They might as well just stay home. It doesn't matter. And that sort of mindset continues for generations and generations, lowering Democratic turnout more and more. And same goes for Republicans and Democratic-controlled states. After every election, we see a general outcry for the Electoral College to be abolished, for the popular vote to be reinstated, because we are a democracy. And you would think that, in general, people would want that. Unfortunately, you would need an amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. And to pass an amendment, most ways to pass one require at least 75% of state legislatures to go forth and to accept that amendment. Unfortunately, there are very, very few Republican-controlled states who are willing to abolish the Electoral College. They want to keep the institution. And sure, fine, maybe they do want to keep the institution for their pure reasons. But that means that we're not going anywhere, and the same rules that continue to hound American democracy and ruin American democracy will continue to stay in place. But there are other alternatives. What are they? Well, we have two options that we could bring to the table. There is proportional voting and ranked choice voting. First, let's go over proportional voting. The way proportional voting would go is that each state could individually decide this, and if some states already follow this, and if they were to accept that model, they would work like this. If you had 60% of a party get the vote and 40% of another party get the vote, then the electors will be split 3-2. Makes sense, right? Uses a 60-40 ratio. The problem with that is that if it works very fine if you only have 5 electors and it's a 60-40 split, because then one candidate gets 3, the other candidate gets 2. But it gets more complicated if, say, you only have 4 electors in a state, and you have 57% of the people vote for one candidate, 3% vote for a third-party candidate, and 40% vote for the other mainstream candidate. How the hell would you split that up? Like, look, I have 4 apple slices right here. Pretend they're real people and electors. If we were in the presidential election and we were doing proportional voting, and I had to split this between 57%, 3%, and 40%, the math wouldn't add up. Unless you do some heavy-duty rounding or decimals. It just wouldn't work like that. Yeah. One of the many problems with proportional voting, because it works fine and dandy if you have a large amount of electors and you have relatively even margins, but if you have bad numbers, things can get quite awkward. And if no one gets over 50% of the vote, they can take all the votes in that state, following winner takes all. However, the system that I prefer the most is probably ranked choice voting, which many of you probably don't know what it is, because it's frankly not that mainstream yet, and not that well known. But the thing with ranked choice voting is that it doesn't punish you for being in a state dominated by one party, and it increases voter turnout and voter encouragement, and it doesn't punish you for voting third party if you're not satisfied with anyone else. Sounds really ideal, doesn't it? So hopefully more states adopt it. But what exactly is ranked choice voting? Well, to begin with, ranked choice voting means that on election day, on your ballot, you mark down who you prefer, from most preferable to least preferable. It's like 1, 2, 3. Then, if no candidate receives more than 50% of the first choice votes, then the candidate who got the least amount of first choice votes gets eliminated like Survivor. They get thrown off a cliff into the ocean and are never heard of again. And instead, all the people who voted for that third candidate who came in last, whoever voted for him, now their second choice votes gets distributed among the remaining people. And then now if it's a candidate who has more than 50% of the votes, if you combine both first choice overall from the first round and second choice votes from the candidate who got eliminated, if there's a majority, then woohoo, we have a winner of this state and they get all the electoral votes from that state. So basically, there will always be a way to ensure that you could vote for whoever you want, and then if there's no majority after that, your votes go to the second choice candidate, and then if the second choice candidate then gets more than 50% of the vote, then at least more people in that state are satisfied overall, and that at least there's a majority in that state now who support X candidate. It's a win-win. Overall, I would say that the Electoral College is one of the Constitution's failures. Why? Well, people aren't voting. It's discouraging. People are confused by it. And it hurts third parties from rising up. All of us, we should try to talk to our local representatives, and we should try to increase the dialogue and the awareness of the Electoral College and the flaws it possesses, and try to raise it back into national conversation rather than waiting for the next general election and then seeing the same old stories pan out. And so I think I'm going to wrap it for now here. If you found this content enjoyable and enjoyed it, that's quite repetitive, my bad. But yeah, if you liked it and if you want to see more in the future, please comment suggestions down below. Please leave a like and please subscribe. It'll mean a lot to me. And now I can finally have those apples that I showed at the beginning of the video.